Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another Sex Matters webinar. I'm Helen Joyce, the Director of Advocacy for Sex Matters, and our topic this evening is sex, gender, and trans issues in the media. And with me, I've got Conrad Roeber, who is an independent media consultant and also a trustee of the LGBT Alliance. He became interested in this topic when he was commissioned by IPSO, that's the Independent Press Standards Organisation, to write a report for them about reporting on trans people and trans issues. We're going to start with a short conversation in which Conrad explains what he learned by doing that work, what the problem was that IPSO was trying to solve and what happened as a result. And we have a few slides that give examples of media coverage during that. And then after just a little discussion, I will turn to the Sex Matters Media Handbook, which we wrote at the end of last year and which we're hoping to get into newsrooms this year. And at the end of the webinar, I will give you a little reveal on what you can do to help. But before that reveal, Conrad and I will have a Q&A. Thanks to all the people who sent us questions when they registered to attend this webinar. It's a great turnout. I think the news in Scotland really gave this a boost. I can't say we saw it coming. We were talking about doing this webinar before Christmas, but it's very, very topical and live today. All right, Conrad, tell us a little bit about why you got interested in this topic.
Well, I got interested in it because friends of mine were starting to think about the whole issue of transgender, how the transgender rights issues interacted with gay rights. And so it was sort of on the edge of my radar screen. And then I was invited to pitch to Ipso to do a piece of analysis, which was really to look at how the subject had been covered over the last 10 years. And we proposed to look at actually the use of language in articles that address transgender issues, as well as talking to people from the entire spectrum of people who are involved, from Stonewall to gendered intelligence to individual trans activists plus feminist activists. In fact, I spoke to you as well during the course of that.
That's when we met. I was at The Economist at the time when you interviewed me.
Yeah, that's right. And Ipso had developed its own guidance for how transgender-related issues should be sort of treated in reporting, which was, I think, released in 2016. And they wanted to check whether it had had any influence on how newspapers were reporting about transgender-related issues. In fact, the guidance probably came after the most heinous problems had been resolved, because effectively, what we discovered is that 10 years previously, when trans-related issues were dealt with in the press, they were prurient, tabloidy, as you show here, particularly the one on the right, which is Kate Stone, who was a scientist, very eminent scientist, who was gored by a stag. And the fact that she's a trans woman was absolutely irrelevant to the story. And in fact, she was one of the sort of interesting highlights of my research, because she was so appalled by the way her accident, which was life-threatening at the beginning, had been covered, that she made official complaints in a very sort of moderate way and went and spoke to the editors of the newspapers and got apologies from them all. And it was one of the first points where the newspapers started thinking, yeah, maybe we shouldn't just be treating transsexuals, as they were commonly referred to then, as a sort of freak show for us to put on our tabloids. There was also one more, which isn't in here, which was the suicide of Lucy Meadows, a tragic suicide of Lucy Meadows, who was a trans woman who transitioned, and then she was a teacher and went back to school. And the way that the story, if there is a story there, was covered by the tabloid press, some say, led to her deciding to take her own life. And that story was referred to by several of the national newspaper editors that I spoke to as being a sort of real wake-up moment for them, because they thought, goodness me, we're not just dealing in some sort of freak show, we're actually dealing in humans. So that was the first, now about 15 years ago, that was the sort of, when you saw trans-related issues being dealt with in the press, that was what you saw. Prurient, tabloidy, very disrespectful. But because of the actions of people like Kate, the sex swap scientist called by the newspapers did sort of wake up to what they were doing, and they were a little bit ashamed of what had gone before. And I think that shame has something to do with then what happened in terms of how they treated the issues. Do you want me to carry on talking about that?
Yeah, maybe we could go and show the next slide, which I think is a sort of, the problem now, which is coverage from the last 2 days. So what are we looking at here?
Yeah, so this is the top story in the news at the moment, where a man committed heinous sexual crimes, two rapes, and then decided to transition to female. We don't know what his motivations were there, or whether it was indeed a lifelong problem for him. And the story is reported in the press as a trans woman raped women, and that not in all press, I have to say. It's quite interesting to see the variety, but certainly in the mainstream, most of the mainstream press, this person, who used to be known as Adam Graham, is referred to as a she, and so you have some of the articles which refer to her penis, and of course that's an absurdity. And yeah, even on the BBC 6 o'clock news tonight, the story which headlined the news referred to her and she throughout the story. It did have to explain what they were doing, but so that's if you like. Go on. Sorry.
I was going to say we have a few more slides on the pictures on the next slide. So this isn't an isolated incident. I mean, these are pictures of press coverage from around the world from the last few years. Daughter accused of stabbing father. Well, this daughter is a son. Woman 26 sent for trial after appearing in court accused of raping man twice. Well, it was a man who did the rape, and so on and on and on. And it's not just with rapes, is it? Of course, it's with sport and with,
Exactly.
First woman to do something and so on. Okay, so we've got our slides there. And do you think this is overshoot? Do you think this is the over-application of a well-meaning rule, or total confusion, or capture, or what? I mean, I guess we'll get into that in a bit more, but what do you think?
It's a combination of everything, because effectively most of the mainstream news editors and their news teams didn't really understand transsexualism or transgenderism, whichever word you want to use, and because there are so few transsexuals, and it had never really been an issue that they'd noticed very much. And at the point at which the coverage was most heinous, if you like, there were certain individuals and groups who took it upon themselves to re-educate the newspapers. I'm not saying that they necessarily succeeded, but they certainly made a concerted attempt. At the same time, Stonewall in 2015 went from being a same-sex attracted focused charity to one that was focused on transgender rights as well. And Stonewall has a very special place in the sort of firmament, if you like, because until very recently, Stonewall was considered the authority on all issues relating to LGBT matters. And so it would be completely normal, and I imagine you experienced this at The Economist, for a journalist to sort of defer to Stonewall if they wanted to know how to refer to people or whatever. So I think Stonewall's adoption of a particular version of explaining what transgenderism is about became the accepted one, along with, there was a particular group called On Road Media, run by a woman called Natalie McDermott, who witnessed a trans woman being pushed onto a tube train, and the subsequent coverage of it focused on man dressed as woman pushed under the train. It was actually a much more complicated story than that, but basically she was very affected by this coverage and decided to set up a campaign which was funded by the BBC and Channel 4, where they would go around to the news outlets and talk to them about how trans people should be discussed in their outlets. And in doing that, given what we said earlier about how bad the newspapers had been in covering issues around transgender people, they were very open to listening to what All About Trans wanted to say. And they did it in a very clever way they took trans individuals to meet the editorial teams, and they had lunches where a trans person would sit next to an editorial person, another trans person. So they used what is, undoubtedly the empathy and sympathy that people feel for people who have gender dysphoria, and they used it to both sort of try and get rid of the disrespectful way in which coverage was being conducted, but also to introduce a way of looking at the transgender experience that actually was not scientific or factual or based on any research, but was the one preferred by the trans lobbies. And I'm talking here about the use of the concept of gender identity, i.e. that everyone has a gender identity which could be the same as their biology or could be different. And if it's different, then you're trans. Now, that is just a theory.
Yeah, that's just a theory, and it's a religious
theory. It's a theory that's used. It's just used. It's a theory that was developed to explain the experience of being trans. It isn't true in any sense. You can't measure this. You can't actually see whether people have a gender identity or not. And also, if you have a sense of who you are inside, it has to be based on who you are physically. Your brain is sexed. Your body is sexed. So it doesn't really hold much water, but this was introduced to the press, not just by people like All About Trans, but also Stonewall and others, and very rapidly adopted, not just by the press, but by government as well. I mean, when the Women in the Equalities Commission started looking at whether or not gender recognition should be made easier, i.e. the introduction of self-ID, they just adopted this approach about gender identity wholesale. And by 2016, I think it is, 2019, the government had officially, the Office of National Statistics, published how the government views the experience of transgender people, and said sex is this, gender identity is that. So it was enshrined in languages. It's not yet been enshrined in law. That's something that obviously we are concerned about. But so everyone adopted without question this way of looking at transgender people. No one has ever denied the existence of transgender people and that they have gender dysphoria, that they believe that they are in, if you like, the wrong body. You can't be in the wrong body, but that's just a belief. But for everyone to accept that the cause of that is that this internal sexed soul is, everyone has one, and it might be different from your sexed body, was absolutely extraordinary. And I think that's when doing the research for my report on reporting, I had a real problem, because one of the things that Ipsos cares tremendously about is accuracy in reporting, in news reporting particularly. And I kept reading articles that refer to gender identity and using that gender identity to explain gender dysphoria, i.e. the experience of being trans. And I was like, well, this isn't accurate. This is not accurate reporting. And everyone still does it, actually, to be honest. It's not questioned, but I mean, more papers have started questioning it, but that was the most astonishing thing.
Yeah, so I think what we'll do now is I'm going to do some slides that show the media handbook that we at Sex Matters have put together. And, we haven't really started the hard work, the hard graft of getting this into newsrooms. We've done it by happenstance, by sending it to interested journalists, and also by doing this webinar, which I think quite a few journalists have signed up to. But then we're going to be looking for help from supporters in getting people aware of these issues, and further thoughts very much appreciated. But we have a hard road to follow, because there's been, as you say, a really wholesale adoption of something that's been taken as fact, but also taken as good. It's actually meant to be bigoted to think that this is not the right explanation for the trans experience. And when people who say that accuracy is important to them say things that are inaccurate, but refuse to accept it, it's really hard to know where to go with that. All right, let's start with our slides now, and I'll just go through those. Right, so the point of producing this was to help editors and reporters to find their way back to professional excellence. What we find in all sorts of areas is that if people just did their job on this issue the same way as they do their job on every other issue, it's likely to be sorted. So as you said, Ipso, as Conrad said, Ipso cares about accuracy. Well, if they're accurate, then they will be doing an awful lot better than they are now. All right, the next slide, please. So these are the principles of ethical journalism on anything. This is not special to trans issues. You want to be honest, accurate, impartial, rigorous, and to respect privacy. And the things that any journalist should seek to avoid are things like libel, contempt of court, special things like identification of the victim of a sexual assault. And if you take those principles over to the next slide, then you get a starting point, which is, there's a famous quote from a famous editor at The Guardian, which is, comment is free, but facts are sacred. So the facts are sacred bit does include that there are only two sexes. And I think anyone who's come to a Sex Matters webinar knows everything that I've written on this slide. But if you're watching it back, you can pause and read this, but I will not bore you all with what man, woman, male and female and so on mean. And yet, incredibly, we seem to have forgotten this. So that's what we're trying to say to journalists. You already know these facts, use them. Next slide, please. And among the facts are that you can't change sex. It may be that you can present yourself as a member of the opposite sex, or that you feel like a member of the opposite sex, or you use legal provisions that allow you for some purposes to be deemed as a member of the opposite sex. But anyway, most people who identify as trans don't go through that legal route. Most of them don't have any sort of surgery or medical treatment. So we all know this, but I think a lot of journalists still don't, and they make assumptions about what it is to be trans that are not correct. Next slide, please. So then we translate the principles for journalism into journalism on sex and gender. And that gives you some kind of obvious things, but a lot of journalists don't think them. So a lot of journalists now think that to report someone's sex accurately may be illegal in some circumstances. But the only time it can be illegal is if you discovered that they are not the sex they're presenting themselves as. By official means, you discovered that they have a gender recognition certificate. But that's not how we find out what sex people are. We look at them. We know what sex people are. If you knew the person before they transitioned, like Caitlyn Jenner, it's not illegal to say that Caitlyn Jenner is a man. It can't be. We know he's a man. He was Bruce Jenner. And so we go through and we turn these principles of accuracy, comprehensibility, speaking to your audience, being clear, not misleading people, not being biased, into actionable things that journalists should be able to do on this particular topic. Okay, next slide, please. So journalists are meant to always inform their audience. That's what you're meant to think about. The audience matters more than the people you're writing about. That doesn't mean you shaft the people you write about. It means that you're doing this for the audience, not for we're not PR, is what I'm trying to say. And if you're not PR, then it's a secondary consideration what the people you're writing about want. The primary consideration is the people you're speaking to. And we went around the houses a bit on this, because some people would say that you should never refer to somebody by anything other than their sex. But we thought about it and we thought, what if you're asking for a 1 or 2 line quote on stock prices? Or, somebody's the world expert on a particular type of genome, and that person happens to identify as a member of the opposite sex and to use pronouns that don't match their sex. It doesn't strike me as a problem, because it's just not relevant to the story. So always the question is, what's relevant to your story, and what does your audience need to know to understand your story? So if a person that you mention's sex is relevant to the story, then you're going to have to state that. If the fact that they're trans is relevant to the story, you're going to have to state that. So if a trans woman has an opinion on whether trans people should be allowed to compete in sporting categories that are not, your natal sex, then we have to say that's a trans person, because this person is in a situation that is meaningful. To understand why they think the way they do, you need to know who they are, rather like saying that somebody is conflicted in a legal story. And then in stories where sex matters, it's not always about the people, it can be about the topic. So if it's about sport, or if it's about crime, or if it's about business, anywhere where sex differences are large, it may be important to talk about the sex of everybody involved. So we say use sex-based pronouns, if possible, for any story where sex matters. And if you can't, if you've been told as a journalist that you're not allowed to use sex-based pronouns for people if they don't want that, see if you can reword to avoid pronouns. I could ridiculously easily have rewritten all those stories about Isla Bryant, or whatever his name is, leaving out pronouns if I wasn't allowed to call him a man. I just would not have used she. All right, next slide, please. And then to avoid misleading language, sex assigned at birth, or worse, gender assigned at birth. Nothing's assigned at birth, it's recorded. Just basically think, does the audience know what I mean here? So we say, don't say trans woman won, definitely don't say woman won sports competition when it's actually a man. But even trans woman is very confusing to a lot of people. So we suggest saying trans identifying man, or Joe Bloggs, a male who started identifying as a woman last year, was convicted of rape, won a female swimming competition, that sort of thing. It should always be crystal clear. Your audience should be able to understand what you're saying. That's the first principle. And not to use ideological language like cis, gender identity, as Conrad said, and to say that somebody could transition from male to female. It's not possible. I think a lot of the problem has come because people think you can do this. Next slide, please. Journalists really shouldn't have to understand the Equality Act 2010. It's for service providers and for employers. But it's been misused an awful lot to say that the Equality Act says that if you identify as a woman, you must be treated as a woman. So we've tried to give people the sort of basics about not so much what the Equality Act does, but what the Equality Act does not do. It does not, for example, make it illegal to refer to someone's sex or to accurately report direct or documented speech. Next slide, please. And then we trot through a number of special topics, either fields or groups of people that journalists should take particular care when they're talking about or when they're reporting on. So reporting on women, don't use horrible language like cervix havers or uterus owners or menstruators. And don't feel that the words girl, woman, female, or mother are in any way ambiguous. Everyone knows what they mean. They mean females of certain ages or who have certain relationships to other people. And then don't be biased. This is another thing that both IPSO and the broadcasting regulator Ofcom say is don't describe groups in biased or bigoted ways. Don't suggest that certain religions or certain races are more stupid or more ugly or bad in some way. But yet when it comes to talking about very large groups of people who hold certain beliefs, namely that sex is real and matters, there's a remarkable amount of bigotry in the way that people write about it, assuming that only somebody who is transphobic would want to exclude men who identify as women from women-only services. So we're trying to get journalists to think about this topic the same way they think about everything else. Would I assume bad faith in people? Would I write or speak about them in a bigoted way? Next slide, please. The famous LGBTQIA++ people, of whom Conrad is one. And I think they're all very different. You're not very like a lesbian woman, and you're not very like a transsexual, and I really don't think you're particularly QIA++. And the issues that arise for people under this umbrella are quite different, and yet they tend to be all swept in. So people assume, for example, that allowing trans athletes to compete in the category they want to is an LGBT issue. Well, actually, an outsized number of female sports players are lesbian, and it's bad for them. So it's not so obvious that this is an LGBT issue. So we recommend not using umbrella terms, but that's a sort of an accuracy idea that journalists should always be as specific as they can be. And the issues that affect different people under the umbrella are different as well. So gay men are more affected, for example, by HIV. Sport, lesbians need female-only sport in a way that gay men don't. Okay, next slide. Children, the most important and perhaps the most upsetting of the ways in which journalists have done badly recently, suggesting that there are trans children. So even if you think that trans is a good word to use for adults with gender dysphoria or adults who identify as members of the opposite sex, it's not a good word to use for children. So we explain that most children who identify out of their sex don't continue to do so. Their gender dysphoria or confusion resolves. It's an example of the way that I think a lot of journalists really are not doing their due diligence. They're assuming, without doing any research, that they know what they're talking about. So we explain that there's no consensus on treatment and there are very serious gaps in the research and evidence base. Next slide, please. Transition. Somehow we've got to a point where you're not meant to mention people's genitals. Well, we never used to have to mention people's genitals because we knew which sort of genitals each group had and we didn't have to say so. But now we've got to the point that it's rude to say that a man who identifies as a woman has male genitals. But if we're talking about women-only spaces or prisons, as in the case of Isla, I think it's relevant whether this person has had genital surgery or not. I don't think myself that it makes a difference to whether they should be moved into a female prison, but I think it's relevant. People want to know it. That's the question journalists always ask. Does your audience want to know this? And is it reasonable for them to know this? We warn people not to retroactively transition people. So this is like saying that Caitlyn Jenner won the decathlon back in the Olympics in whatever year it was. Well, there isn't even a female decathlon, and he was Bruce Jenner when he won it. And to remember that other people may be involved in a story about a trans person. So that person may have had a wife, a husband, children. Those people still have a mother or a father. And it's not respectful to write those people out. Next slide. Suicide. There are strong guidelines on how to write about suicide and how to talk about suicide in the media. And incredibly, they are constantly ignored when it comes to trans issues. So it's routinely suggested that trans-identifying people have enormously high rates of suicide, that children will inevitably commit suicide if they aren't allowed to transition. None of this is true, and it's very dangerous. So I wish the Samaritans would step in and say to the British media, could you please follow our guidelines, which are general when it comes to trans issues, but they don't. So we're trying to point that out to journalists. When we talked to Ipsos, we discovered that nobody else had said this to them. Nobody else had raised the way that suicide was covered in trans issues. So hopefully we got that through to them. Next slide, please. Crime. Well, I can tell you a lot of women feel as I do that it's deeply offensive to say she raped. You know, I saw one just a couple of days ago. Woman was found with 80,000 pictures of child abuse on her laptop. And I know before I look any further, this isn't a woman, it's a man, because these are male crimes. So we explain that both the trans lobby groups' explanations of who commits crime and who is at risk of crime are quite seriously distorted. So trans people are not at outsized risk of suicide or violent crime in this country. They may be in Brazil, where many work on the street as prostitutes, which is a very dangerous profession. Next slide, please. Sport. Don't describe trying to have sex-based categories as bigotry or prejudice. Don't talk about it as trans inclusion or trans rights. Talk about them as sex categories, male and female, and check the research about the differences in strength between male and female people. I think when you're writing on sport, it really always will be relevant to say the sex of everybody involved. Next slide, please. I would say that the most bigoted reporting that I see in the British media these days is about people who hold gender-critical beliefs. I think there's no other group that is routinely slurred to the same extent. So describing gender-critical beliefs, namely that sex is real and immutable and important, doesn't mean that a person is anti-trans or transphobic, but that's often the way that it's described. So it shouldn't matter that it's a protected belief under the Equality Act. People shouldn't do this sort of bigoted reporting anyway, but we explain that it is protected. And we also explain that it is the opinion of most people. So a journalist who acts like some strange women occasionally think that men can't be women. Well, 90% plus of the population think that, I'm sure. Next slide, please. We suggest avoiding inflammatory language, TERF and transphobic, and also not suggesting that mentioning people's sex is itself hate speech or a hate crime. Much of the great increase in hate crime reporting in recent years has actually been about people using sex-based pronouns, often quite unintentionally. So again, we need to explain that to journalists. Next slide, please. Right, so a lot of blame is put on the Ipsos editor's code, and specifically on the guidance that came out on trans issues. So the guidance that came out on trans issues, which Conrad referenced, is not a statutory thing. Ipsos isn't statutory, it's a membership organisation, and not all newspapers are members. But specifically, the trans guidance is just trying to translate the general principles into things that editors might like to think about when they're covering trans issues. I think it's a very poor piece of work indeed. But anyway, if you want to talk to a newspaper, you want to complain to a newspaper that is regulated by IPSO, it's the editor's code you need, not the trans guidance. And we explain which are the couple of sections of the editor's code that are most relevant. So the publishing of inaccurate, distorted, or misleading information, and using activist definitions, for example, of sexual orientation could count as that. or prejudicial or pejorative descriptions of individuals based on a range of personal characteristics could also cover some sorts of reporting on trans issues. I don't hold my breath about IPSO actually stepping in and getting newspapers to do better, because they could have done that anytime they liked. But anyway, they are moving because people do complain to them and because they notice what's happening. And I think, as we'll say at the end of this webinar, it may be worth engaging with IPSO. But if you do, you have to actually look and see what its editor's code says. Next slide, please. Oh, right, that was it, of course. Yeah. All right, Conrad, I'm going to come to you and ask you what's top of mind for you after listening to that trot through. Anyone who found they couldn't read at that speed, download the media handbook, or indeed play back and just pause and read the slides.
It reminded me of two or three things that sort of really struck me during my research, and given that we have one of the most plural news reporting environments in the world, is the lack of attention that journalists pay when they do their research. And you mentioned suicide statistics. Some parts of the so-called trans lobby, which is not a really fair term, but weaponized the fear of children committing suicide, which must be a parent's worst nightmare, with a statistic that 48% of young trans people have attempted suicide. It was completely, effectively made up. I mean, without going into a long story. Yet, journalist after journalist and our most respected newspapers would repeat this, because it became one of the most primary motivations for having to look after this very vulnerable minority. And it was just not justified. In fact, the Tavistock Identity Service, Gender Identity Service, said themselves they didn't see a particularly high prevalence of suicide relative to the sort of people that they were seeing. And the other one that has never been challenged, and it continues to be reported, is the prevalence of trans people, which is generally quoted as around 1% of the population, either 700,000 people. And there's no basis for this at all. The government did an interesting, the Equality and Human Rights Commission did an interesting survey of 10,000 people. And of 10,000 people, 25 said they were trans, either a trans male or a trans female, which is just such an insignificant number. You can't draw any conclusions from it. You certainly can't say that 1% of the population, but that to this day is considered the amount. And that gives a lot of weight when you start discussing policies and things. But the thing that your slides really brought back to me is that the position of gender identity. I know we talked about this before, but it's worth repeating. Gender identity sounds so technical. It sounds like a descriptive, technical, scientific thing. If you were to describe it as a sex soul, the soul of your sex, fine, if that's what you believe. But no newspaper will do a news story that talks about someone's soul. If someone dies or is murdered, the reporter doesn't say, at this point their soul is ascending to heaven, or they lived a pretty naughty life, their soul is probably down in purgatory at the moment. It just doesn't happen. You don't, in news reporting, you don't discuss the soul, even though lots of people believe the soul exists. Likewise, the same rule should be applied to gender identity. But it's and I think. Sorry.
Maybe we could dig a bit into why those two things happened. I mean, listening to you talking about this sort of recycling and rehashing of the same figures, I mean, part of it does seem to me to be, the general decline of the media because of loss of money, people having to write more stories, people being under more pressure, experienced journalists being pushed out, much more reliance on clicks. Like when it was all about advertising, basically, as long as people looked at it, it didn't matter so much. I mean, editors used to love getting complaining letters. It's all just eyeballs, isn't it? Do you think it's that, or do you think there's something more particular to Britain or more sinister?
On this, I don't think it's the laziness. I mean, maybe it is that the quantity of material that has to be produced by an average news reporter is higher because they've cut costs so dramatically in all news organisations. So they just simply don't have the time or the energy to. And by the way, when I did this report, which was 2020, it was a much less prominent issue than it is now. And so I think things will change just for that reason alone. it was still a niche issue. Now it is, one of the main issues, oddly, given we've got lots of other problems going on at the moment. But the issue around so-called trans rights is now very hot. So journalists are having to actually explore the subjects in greater depth. And I know several who've said, well, I just didn't understand, I didn't look at it closely, I didn't realize. I think shamefully, and that's where partly the LGBTQIA thing is so convenient for a lot of mainly straight people. It lumps a whole lot of problematic populations into one acronym, and we can sort of deal with them together. And if the main representative groups from that alphabet soup, Stonewall being the primary one, tell us that something is so, then who are we to question it? We're not those people.
So a couple of questions that came in. Dan said he's curious to get your take on left versus right-wing press, and Mary said that public broadcasters in particular have a duty to be impartial. And they really aren't being on this, BBC, and it really doesn't seem to me to be impartial on this. What do you think? Is this something that the left or the right are covering differently? And if so, why? And what can we do about public broadcasting?
Very good questions. Definitely in my experience, speaking to the full range of newspapers from the left, of the national press, there was less willingness to question the trans ideology or the gender identity ideology. I think calling it trans ideology is probably the wrong thing. Gender identity ideology, and obviously most of the main places where these subjects have been questioned and columnists have written with great passion are on the further to the right of the spectrum. And as we know, certain prominent columnists such as Hadley Freeman and Suzanne Moore have been pushed out of The Guardian because they would not accept this ideology. In terms of the broadcasters, it's a very difficult question because the BBC should be absolutely impartial, but as a conversation which has been reported in several outlets between Malcolm Clark and the head of, I think, the BBC Pride Group in BBC Studios, which he had at a bar in Glasgow, where he basically admitted that they seek to influence editorial content when reporting relating to trans-related issues. And that's just simply utterly unacceptable. Our national broadcaster should do its own research, its own journalism. It can listen to groups, but for an internal staff group to be influencing content, it is extremely worrying. I imagine because that story has now reached the light of day, there will be hopefully those within the BBC who'll be making sure that doesn't happen in the future. But you're right, it has been a problem. And I think it goes back to what I was saying about organisations like Stonewall, which have embedded themselves in so many of our institutions. And in doing so, they've become the authority on how certain subjects should be discussed. And no one questioned that, because there was no competition to Stonewall to say, hold on a second, that isn't actually the way that we want to look at this subject.
Do you think there's an element, this is from Beck, that these issues matter far less to male journalists and editors, and that these just get put into the, women are complaining, they're making a fuss, it's not important. It's striking how the Scotland gender recognition reform bill suddenly became of wide interest when it became a constitutional matter. Like, women have been shouting about it for years, but now it's serious. It's the big sort of thing that male journalists write about. Am I being unfair here in saying this, do you think?
I don't think you're being unfair, because I think you can observe that, but that's because a lot of the prominent female voices in this debate have been female, because a lot of the issues are around the impact on feminism, on women's rights. And we are in a funny age where if you do not belong to a particular group, then you don't have any authority to speak on it. So people sort of allow the silos to sort of report on their own issues. But yeah.
So what did you discover about the way that Ipsos influence worked? Like, you wrote this report. I mean, I know you talked to me and you talked to a wide range of people, and then it was quite a long time before it came out, but it's possible that was the pandemic. I might be reading too much into that.
I think they hid it, to be honest. I mean, to be completely frank, I'm not sort of betraying any confidences. They were absolutely terrified that the report would say anything remotely controversial about these issues. I mean, I even had to include in the text at one point, and I was just reading it in preparation for this session, the expression "sex assigned at birth." And, which is part of the whole gender identity framework, which is entirely unscientific. And I mean, sex is obviously observed. It's not. I do discuss it in the issue, but in the report. But they were extremely nervous about what the lobby groups that they had been speaking to, people like Mermaids, would think of the report. In fact, Mermaids insisted that the interview that I did with them be repeated, but with somebody other than me, from the company that was commissioned to do the report. They said they weren't happy because I followed up the interview with a discussion with one of the other trans lobby groups about what gender identity was. I studied philosophy at university, so I found it very problematic, the whole idea of a gendered soul that they insisted that everyone had, which is where the term cis comes from. So cis means the same in Latin. It means that your gendered soul is the same as your sexed body. And so I took objection to this and had an email conversation, a perfectly friendly email conversation, saying I just don't accept that I have a gender identity. There's no, if I have a belief about my gendered soul being different from my body, that's simply a belief. That is all it is. It's no more than that. It's not an objective truth. And because of that conversation, Mermaids insisted that the interview was redone with somebody else and not me. So there was a lot of pressure, and there was a lot of defensiveness and anger. When I went to see Stonewall, they were particularly sort of touchy, and after the event, called me up to challenge me on the suicide statistics, actually, because I brought out the problem of accuracy when journalists just slavishly said 48% of trans people have tried to kill themselves. And he challenged me on that. But it was I think so. Ipso was nervous, and
Why
the report wasn't.
Why did they even commission the report? What was the idea of it?
Well, I think they're doing their homework. They produced guidance, and a couple of years later, they want to see whether the guidance had any effect. I mean, the thing is, Ipso isn't loved as an organisation within the Fleet Street, so to speak. No one loves a regulator, whether it's voluntary or not. So no one admitted to their guidance being remotely instructive for them, though actually the regional press, who said that we have so little experience of trans people in our little news footprints, that when Ipso produces guidance on something, we just take it and we just follow it without questioning it. But sorry, I lost my train.
I'm just looking down through some of the other questions, and there's still people asking, why did the left-wing media get this so wrong? I mean, most people on the left do think of themselves as caring about women's rights and think about, children's safety and safeguarding is very important. And I mean, the comment is free, but facts are sacred quote comes from a Guardian editor, if I remember correctly. How did the Guardian get so lost on this? And how did the other left-wing media do so badly?
That's an extremely good question. And I mean, I think it's something to do with demographics. So younger demographics, but younger, the more left-wing you are, the more you want to probably be seen in this age of virtue signaling as some form of ally to LGBTQIA plus people or trans ally. It's a badge of virtue. And indeed, some of the young journalists I spoke to in those the leftist side of the spectrum, was actually outraged at the questions, even though my questioning was entirely neutral. And I hadn't actually at that point formed a particularly strong opinion about this. It was really a voyage of discovery. But there was a lot of defensiveness. The assumption is that the T is effectively merged with the LGB. We did indeed have to fight huge prejudice, and we had to go through a battle to get the rights that, as gay people, we now have, not least the right to marry. And basically, a huge constituency on the left, probably on the right as well, saw the battle for T rights, trans rights, to be identical battle of gay rights. And no one questioned it, because very few people have actually got trans friends or colleagues, because there are so few. When I say trans, obviously it covers a huge range of people now. Stonewall uses the term trans umbrella, but actually what most people think about when they think about a trans person is what we used to call a transsexual, somebody who wishes to effectively reassign their gender. So I think there was a lazy assumption that since the T had been added to the LGB, this was the battle on the right side of history, and we've heard that expression so many times without actually questioning what was going on. And actually, the ridiculous thing is that, of course, trans people have identical rights to gay people, and since we now have equal marriage, actually, that was an issue for trans people. If you changed your sex, you might want to marry someone of the same sex. So until we had same-sex marriage, that was a problem.
Yes. So what did you learn in doing the research from the journalists who were finding, I know you spoke to some journalists like myself, and I presume people like Janice Turner or Julie Bindel, who were already openly writing about this. Did you talk to journalists who said that they wanted to write more about this but couldn't, or that they would pitch pieces and they didn't get picked, or what?
Weirdly, not during the time that I did the report, because the sort of columns around this, the raising the issues around women's rights, really started kicking off as the report was finished. But subsequently, yes, many. And in fact, if you listen to Hadley Freeman's interview on Women's Hour, just after she left The Guardian, she said, she was not allowed to write on this subject. And I know from others within The Guardian that that's true of other writers there. And when Suzanne Moore wrote an article defending women's rights in relation to this subject, she had a letter was signed by something like over 500 Guardian employees, not naming her, but basically suggesting, is the Guardian going to support transphobic writers? And it was obvious who they meant. So she was effectively hounded out of the newspaper. I think the tide is turning in that respect. And I think, as I said before, because this subject has now just become bigger and bigger and bigger, and will clearly not go away, and it will no doubt come back during the next general election campaign, I think journalists will be doing more and more proper research and proper homework.
Interesting question here from Heather, which is, do you think that actually things like those Scotland headlines will play in our favour? Like they're so waking up moment things, the her penis type headlines. Do they actually?
Yeah.
Are they the thing that might be the catalyst for better coverage?
Well, interestingly, yes, but yeah. I mean, I don't know. I think this comes to what do readers? How do newspapers get feedback from their readers? Because I think all of the polls, certainly there were lots of polls done in Scotland before the Gender Recognition Reform Act was passed, and they showed that the vast majority of Scottish people were not in favour of the change that was being proposed, regardless of how this subject has been reported in the press. And in fact, I think the press is extremely slavish when it comes to this. But maybe individual readers should be a bit more proactive in complaining about the inaccuracies of referring to a male as a female.
How do you feel yourself, Conrad, about the pronouns? Because I noticed that the cases that you mentioned from before Ipsos guidance, in both cases you did refer to trans women as she. What's your personal way of working through that?
Yeah, it is sort of personal, really, because I think there's a difference between sort of how I think about it on principle and possibly if I were a journalist, as distant from the subject, as you'd expect them to be. Pronoun should simply describe someone's sex. It's sex matters, as you know, and you need to know someone's sex. If you're a teacher organising a camping trip with your class, you need to know the sex of every single child, and so that you can put them in the right tents or dormitories or whatever. So it's a bit like me saying the idea that you can sort of choose your pronouns. It's a bit like saying, well, I can choose my height. So you can't refer to me as 5'10". I want to be referred to as 6'2". But that's just simply factually inaccurate. But they are a bit of a difficult thing, because obviously I have known trans people, and loveful people, and who fully transitioned as far as they can, and I would, in my personal life, refer to that person as she, because her gender dysphoria was resolved as far as it could be by the transition from male to female. And I just feel, and that's where be kind, if you like, it's a personal judgment for all of us, but that's where be kind comes in. People you know, people you interact with. But that doesn't mean that be kind can be translated into law. Because at the end of the day, you do need to know. You need to know whether you're sticking a male in a female's prison, or you're putting a male nurse in with a female who doesn't want a male nurse to examine them or wash them. So, there is a big difference between what you do in describing the world and describing how rules and laws should be made, and what you do on an absolutely personal, individual level in terms of treating other humans. Like, we all laugh at our friends' jokes, which are terrible. We basically tell them that they're funny when they're not. Or we tell people they look fantastic when they don't. I mean, I'm sorry, we go through life telling these little fictions in our personal life, but we don't extend those fictions to the institutional and legislative world, and nor should we.
That's a really good distinction. I mean, plenty of journalists are, for example, religious, but if you're doing news coverage, you don't infuse your religion or your activism or your personal viewpoint or your family's wealth or something like that. You have to be independent in the way you do it. So I think that's a reasonable distinction. I know there will be people watching this webinar who don't, but I think everyone comes down in different places, and the point is what you do in your profession is what we're talking about here. We're not telling journalists how they speak in their private lives. Somebody says, what do you think is the likelihood? I think this is a question for both of us. What do you think there's the likelihood that journalists will actually en masse, or outlets will en masse, improve how they're dealing with this, to the extent that we might actually be happy and think that our guidance was obsolete?
The only point of the data point we have for that was tonight's new coverage on BBC News, where they did explain. They referred to Ilsa?
Isla, I think. Or Isla, I think, but I could be wrong.
As she, but then explained in great detail that when she was Adam Graham, a man, but they did talk about having become a woman. This is on the 6 o'clock news. Now, Adam Graham has not become a woman. Adam Graham cannot become a woman. Adam Graham hasn't even had a gender recognition act, which would create
gender recognition certificate,
certificate, which would create the legal fiction of being female at birth. That's another question. So we're not there yet, as evidenced by that news report. But they did realise that they couldn't, they had to explain to the average viewer what was going on here.
I thought it was interesting. Maya Forstater, our director, was on Times Radio, and the presenter said she about this rapist, and Maya said that's an insult to every woman, and I'm not calling a rapist she. And actually, the presenter then immediately switched to he for the rest of the item. So I thought that was quite interesting and wouldn't have happened a year ago.
It's interesting that you could look at the newspapers that covered this story over the last few days, and the Telegraph studiously and admirably avoided using pronouns at all, given Ipso guidance and given where we are and the sensitivity around pronouns. But the Guardian used she, the Times used she completely as if Adam had become a woman. And so there is somewhere to go. It's funny, in the one of the things that the editors I spoke to resisted fiercely were using the expression assigned gender at birth, assigned sex at birth. They just said it doesn't make sense. Our readers wouldn't understand what you're talking about. And the other one they pushed back on was non-binary identities, referring to people in an article as they. And again, there is a spectrum of approaches. The Guardian always refers to subjects by their preferred or imagined gender identity, and which makes for very peculiar reading when talking about Sam Smith. Sam Smith is sort of more than one person, but other newspapers are studious in not referring to people as they. And I think we're in a transition phase, because it's just terrible writing to refer to a singular subject as they or use them. It just doesn't read well. And I mean, I think at some point it's, I hope people will realize that this just doesn't make any sense.
So the last thing I'd like to ask you before I do our sort of call to action for viewers is, did you get any sense from the journalists and editors that you spoke to that getting any sort of feedback on these issues would be in any way helpful or useful or listened to? I mean, I'll say what I think as well from working at The Economist, but I'm keen to hear what you found.
Yes, I think they are deeply concerned about what their readers think at all times. Now, obviously, how many papers sell is one thing, but because most papers are now websites or apps which have comments underneath them, they get very good feedback from readers, and all the writers will look at the feedback online, and that's probably the easiest way to provide feedback. There are more formal routes, but they do care tremendously. That's their trade, is to inform readers and do it in a way that makes sense to them and gives them the news that they want. So I think they care tremendously. Yeah.
Good. What I would say, having worked in a newsroom for a long time, is that one of the purposes of getting letters about what you write is in strengthening your hand in internal negotiations. So organisations are not individuals, and it's easy to say, oh, the Guardian has got lost on this or the BBC has got lost on that. But when you're inside this profession, there's a range of opinions. And there are people who are quite beleaguered inside those organisations who are trying to push back against the language of gender identity. And if readers or viewers write and say, I watched this item, I had this problem with it, you're strengthening the hand of the people inside the organisation who want to change the sort of change that you want. Well, I'm going to say goodbye to Conrad now, and I'm just going to spend a couple of minutes telling everybody about the tool that Sex Matters is developing. So thank you so much, Conrad, and thank you for the work.
Thank you very much. Lovely
and people can read that report still on Ipsos' website.
James,
you're still there, yes. Right, so what we have is we've got our own media handbook is online at that URL, the media-handbook URL. You can download it, you can share it, you can send it to a journalist that you like, you can send it to editors. I mean, I don't think they want to get 1,000 copies of it, but if there's some journalist that you have some relationship with, or if indeed you are a journalist, or you know somebody in the local press, it would be worth sending them this. And now in beta form, we have a new reporting tool that we put live today, and it works, but we don't know if it's exactly formulated to get exactly what we want from it. So we very much want you to try it out. So if you go to sexmatters.org/bad-media-watch, what you'll do is you'll find yourself somewhere that you can upload a link to a bad article. This is not so that we can complain on your behalf, because we can't. The complaint has to come from you. It's so that we can build up a picture, and that then when we go and visit newsrooms and say to editors or journalists, you're doing well on this, you're doing badly on this, we've had more complaints about you than we've had about anybody else, here are 6 terrible articles, can we talk about those? We have the evidence that we need. But what we've done is we've tried to pick out the most relevant bits of Ofcom's broadcasting code. That's for all regulated broadcast media, the terrestrial TV, digital TV, on demand. There's actually hundreds of media organisations, most of which you won't have heard of, and Ofcom regulates them. But IPSO regulates a lot of the press, and then the ones that aren't members of IPSO have their own complaints mechanisms, usually via a reader's editor or a panel. So we've done our best for the best known media organisations to say how you can complain. We've tried to explain what the clauses are in those guides or those codes that are most likely to come up, and also what the most likely things to complain about are: that somebody is using misleading or biased language, that there's poor balance in the people who are talked to. This sort of headline is the sort of thing we expect you sending us. I mean, whatever about the Telegraph, they actually changed this online before I caught it. Conrad sent me that one: trans female raped women while she was living as a man, which I think is the worst one on this. Someone pointed out to them that that's appalling, and they got rid of it sharpish. So you can send us these, and you can also write to them, and we give you a sort of an escalating set of things that you can do. You can just write informally to the journalist. You can write to the editor. You can look up and go their formal route. You can explain what you're complaining about. There's special procedures for the BBC, because it's the national broadcaster, and it's got special statute about it. And then in the end, if you don't get anywhere, you can complain to Ofcom or to IPSO. I'm not saying that you're necessarily going to get change to the article that you're complaining about or the item that you're complaining about, but what you can do is you can help to improve things in the future. And we do hope that everybody helps us to do that this year, because we think it'll be extremely useful in shifting or speeding up the shift that's already underway, and help us when we go and talk to people in the media. Well, that's it for this evening. So thank you all for coming, and we will soon be announcing what our next webinar is. And in the meantime, get reading. If you want to be a supporter of Sex Matters, you can get merch, you can sign up for our memo, and you can just be in touch and find out what's happening every week. And you don't have to be a member or supporter to support our actions. Just come back to our website or follow us on Twitter. Thank you all very much.